a class on Zionism. I used to do this a little more frequently, so now we're going to continue it and see if it gains traction. But the first class we're going to do is 18 facts about Israel that every 18-year-old American needs to know. These are essential facts that people don't know, that people sometimes get wrong, or just have never learned before, and it's important for them to know. So let's get started with just a little introduction. As high school seniors graduate, their attention starts to turn to college. Unfortunately, a lot of American universities are bastions of anti-Zionism, anti-Israel lectures, and activism. And as the ADL, right, which is America's watchdog over hate speech and anti-Semitism, states that the campus anti-Israel movement frequently denigrates Zionism as inherently racist, which we know is incorrect, and disparages pro-Israel students, at times invoking anti-Semitic tropes. So with these 18 facts that we're about to study together are designed not to give American Jewish students, let's say, the tools that they need to defeat the campus anti-Israel movement, but rather to know the truth about Israel and identify the lies that are told about Israel. That's also essential. It's essential that students understand when they hear something that might be a lie. They have to understand it for themselves, not just to tell other people. So the first thing that's important for people to know is that Israel is not dangerous. Okay, this is a common mistake that a lot of people make that's out there. They think that Israel is a dangerous place, and it's understandable, because if all of your knowledge of Israel came from the media, so you'd also assume that Israel, that has been a war zone for 75 years. Now Israel's been in a lot of wars, more than most people, more than most nations, but it's not a war zone, right? The media covers the most sensational stories. That's what it does, including violent ones. It doesn't talk about what the average experience for an Israeli is. So there's little violence in Israel compared to, let's say, America, which doesn't have wars but has a tremendous amount of violence on the streets. So there's statistically much more violence in American streets than there are in Israel. Okay, but the perception that Israel's a violent place, but really Israel's a calm and peaceful place, and it's a pleasure to visit. So that's the first thing to understand, that Israel is not a dangerous place. Okay, understanding Israel. Here's our second fact that American students need to understand, is that understanding Israel requires an open mind, intellectual honesty, and nuance. This is tremendously important. That in today's partisan world, people prefer to box all subjects into black and white, no grays, nothing else, no other colors. But the world, we know, is not that simple. It's a complex world. And like the world, so too Israel is very complex. Okay, you can't just box Israel into something. So to understand Israel in all its complexity, a person has to have an open mind to accept facts, narratives that they might never have heard before. You can't just assume that you know everything because you once heard a story from somebody. And by the way, it goes on both sides. It goes on the pro-Israel side, it goes on the anti-Israel side. People need to do research, and they need to be intellectually honest, so they can be open to arguments that they haven't heard before, and recognize that most stories have two sides to them. And that, in order to understand that requires a tremendous amount of nuance. So understanding Israel requires an open mind, intellectual honesty, and nuance. That's our second point. Okay. Let's get on to our third point here. Okay. So you should visit Israel on birthright, but don't think that Israel can be fully understood on a 10-day 10-day tour of Israel. So college students are eligible. College Jewish students are eligible to visit Israel on birthright. Christian students have their own types of trips that they're eligible for. These are heavily discounted trips. They're almost completely free. Sometimes they are free. Natalie, I see your point 100%. Completely agree on our last point here. So the trip to Israel is going to give you a front row seat to Israel. And it's a lot of fun. It's well worth going on that type of a trip. So studying Israel from 6,000 miles away just isn't enough. At the same time, it's important to recognize that 10 days on a fun trip also isn't enough to fully understand Israel. The more time that someone spends in Israel, the more they'll come to understand Israel. So 10 days in Israel, great idea. Definitely take the trips that are offered for sure. Take advantage of them. It's so worth it. But at the same time, to recognize the fact that that's not going to give you a full understanding of the thing. Okay. Our next point: the media presents an inaccurate picture of Israel. Okay, this is our fourth fact to understand. That there's a lot of theories suggested why the media generally presents a negative image of Israel and its coverage. But one thing that's almost universally agreed upon is that Israel is portrayed with a bias against it by most of the world's media. Now, I've seen people that say that that's not true, that Israel gets a fair shake, that it's really the Palestinians that aren't getting honest media coverage. I mean, I don't know how anybody says such a thing. It's almost clear how blatantly anti-Israel most of the Western media is, and for sure not in the Western media. Okay, so their biased coverage is generally delivered without proper context. Okay, Israel, right? So yeah. Okay, so 1 second. I'm sorry. Okay, so Israel is Israel's usually covered without proper context, and Israel's policies and actions are presented in a negative shade without Israel's side of the story, right? That's what generally happens. So to understand events in Israel, a person always has to ask themselves, what's the Israeli side of the story? In other words, you're clearly not going to get the full picture when it comes to Israel from the media. You have to recognize that, right? So if you're not going to get the full picture, and you're not going to see everything, so then it's up to you to then ask the questions that are required for in order for you to be able to understand what the proper side of the story is, what the Israel side of the story. Okay. Natalie, if you write to me, I'll send you the facts, 100%. Okay. The Jewish people are a nation. They're not just a religion. This is our fifth fact that's essential for people to know, to understand. So many times people get this wrong, and they think that the Jewish people are a nation, and they think the Jewish people are just a religion, and they're not a nation. Now, it's a great way of delegitimizing the state of Israel is stating that Jews are a religion, and that religions don't deserve certain rights. In other words, if you're just a religion, so you have the right to pray wherever you want and to worship your God in the way you want to worship God, but you can't demand a land. Religions don't get a land. Religions don't get self-determination. Religions have the right to practice freely their religion, but they do not have the same rights as nations. The Jewish people for 3,000 years have been known as a nation. They haven't been known as just a religion. When people come and attack us and say, well, Judaism is just a religion, so why does it get a land? You can't get more anti-Semitic than that, because it's robbing us of our peoplehood, right? We are a nation, and what makes us a nation is the fact that we're one unit and we come from one place, right? We come from where's that place that we come from? We come from Israel. That's why Jews aren't really called Jews. Jews are really Israelites. Am Yisrael, the nation of Israel. That's what we are. So that's the idea that we are people. We're not just a religion. We have a historic homeland, the land of Israel, and we have every right to that land because that is our national homeland, because we are a nation. Okay, so the fifth point to review is that the Jewish people are a nation. They're not just a religion. Okay, we happen to be a nation that's also a religion, but we're primarily a nation, and then we also have religious tenets that we hold by. But if a Jew would come along and say, I'm not going to, I don't think that having keeping kosher is so important. So then that doesn't mean that they're not Jewish anymore, right? They're just as Jewish as any other Jew. Okay. The Jewish people, this is our sixth point here. The Jewish people have the strongest claim to the land of Israel. Okay, so when Zionists came back, a great knock that people still incredibly use, even though it's so ignorant, is saying that Jews are colonial imposters and that we have no rights or connections to this land. And from the river to the sea is simply Palestine, and there was never a place called Israel. And I mean, it's absolutely incredible. But historical records, archaeology, international consensus, they all demonstrate that the Jews have a longer connection to the land of Israel. It's over 3,000 years old, more than any other people around today. Right? Arabs only came to this land. Forget about Palestinians. Arabs only came to this land 1,300 years ago. Okay, so that's clearly the Jewish people have the strongest claim to this land. It's almost a joke when people say that we have no claim to this land. Now, that doesn't mean that nobody else should live in this land, or that the rights aren't murky of what other people have. But it's ludicrous to come along and say that the Jewish people don't have a strong claim to this land. Okay, let's sound is gone. Interesting. Hold on. Here, a second. And now the sound should be back. Okay, I appreciate that, Natalie. Okay, so now, so the Jewish people have a right to self-determination. Okay, now this is incredibly important. Okay, that the Jewish people have a right to self-determination. That for close to 2,000 years, the Jewish people were in exile and were controlled by other governments, that in the lands that we lived in. So we lived in Poland, we were controlled by the Polish. We lived in Yemen, the Yemenites controlled us, right? Whichever government was in charge there. But now we always had a right to exercise self-determination. Nobody ever takes that right away from you, but they prevented us from exercising that right. No one would allow Jews to determine their own destiny. We were always at the hands of other people. Zionism wasn't just a movement that said Jews should go back and live in the land of Israel. Zionism was a movement that advocated for the Jews to determine their own future. And the future that they were going to determine for themselves was going to be that they would be in the land of Israel and create their own Jewish state in that land. So that's the right to self-determination, and that is an incredibly important point. So that's our seventh point, that Jews have a right to self-determination. Now, this eighth point that we're gonna look at sounds kind of good. It's not Instagram. Okay, now it should work. Sorry, I think my mic was out of battery, so I switched microphones. Hopefully this is working now. Okay. And for those on other platforms, I hope that your patience is rewarded by understanding this. Okay, great. Okay, so now Jews have been in Israel continuously for 3,000 years. Okay, so now this is, a lot of people think, even Jews get this wrong. Jews think that we were exiled 2,000 years ago. First of all, we weren't even exiled 2,000 years ago. The Romans did exile us 2,000 years ago, but a lot of Jews remained behind. It was when the Arabs came, some 1,300 years ago, that's when we were truly exiled out of the land. But a lot of people think that Jews then left the land and weren't back we were never in the land after that we were just completely gone from the land. Now, that's not true. Jews have been in the land for 3,000 years continuously. For 3,000 years continuously, we were in the land. Now, Zionism was a political movement that was 175 years old, but Jews have lived here continuously. There's been a small community in Israel for 3,000 years. And what that community does is it connects the Jews from around the world to be in this community. So when millions of Jews returned to Israel over the past 100 years, they weren't moving to a new location. What they were doing was rejoining a 3 millennium old Jewish community, right? So that's an incredibly important point to recognize, is the fact that Jews did not create a Jewish state here 75 years ago, right? So the Jews were here for 3,000 years. Okay. Let's look at number 9. Okay, number 9 is that Jerusalem has been the capital of the Jewish people for thousands of years. Okay, so almost 3,000 years ago, King David, the king of the Jewish people, inaugurated the city of Jerusalem as the capital city of the Jewish people. After the Jewish nation was defeated and exiled, so they spent 3,000 years praying to return to Jerusalem. And we still pray to return to Jerusalem because we're praying for a rebuilt Jerusalem. I prayed a couple hours ago and prayed to come back to Jerusalem while standing in Jerusalem. I prayed. So no other people has ever, let's get this fact straight here so everybody understands this. No other people has ever established Jerusalem as their capital. Okay? And there's never been another people here that have established Jerusalem as the capital. Palestinians say Jerusalem's their capital. When did that happen? I know when it happened with the Jews. It happened 3,000 years ago with King David. So in 1948, the Jews reestablished their capital as Jerusalem. And in 1967, they united. For the first time, the city was divided for 19 years, from 1948 to 1967. In 1967, the Israeli army took control of the eastern part of Jerusalem that had been Jordan's for the last 19 years before that, and the entire city came under Jewish control, which it is still 56 years later today. And that is an essential point, that Jerusalem has been the capital of the Jewish people for thousands of years. Palestinians have aspirations of making Jerusalem their capital, but it was never an Arab capital. It was only a Jewish capital. Okay, let's look at number 10. Anti-Zionism is usually a cover for anti-Semitism. Okay, an important point to note. Zionism, it stands for the rights of the Jewish people to have self-determination in their historical homeland. Now, the land of that, and that's obviously Israel, denying, as we said before, the peoplehood of the Jewish people, claiming that unlike all other religions, we're the only ones that don't deserve self-determination, or that we have no rights or connections to our homeland. That's not a political argument. That's straight hate. That's anti-Semitism. Treating us differently than any other nation and saying that we don't get to have our own homeland, that's simply anti-Semitism. That is hate. So anti-Zionism, an important point to recognize, is not a political position. A lot of people trying to cover it up and say it's a political position. It is not a political position. What it is straight out hate. Okay, that is our 10th point. Okay, let's look at number 11. Treating Israel with a double standard is anti-Semitic. Okay, now we've all seen accusations made against Israeli policies. Most are not reflective of the truth. Many are made out of context, and even more hold Israel to a standard that no other country is held up to when it comes to international standards. Judging Israel with a double standard is nothing short of anti-Semitic. It's not a policy to hold Israel in greater, to say Israel's our friend, so we're going to hold it to a higher standard. Israel claims to be a democracy, so we're going to hold it to a higher standard. No, that double standard is anti-Semitic, and it reflects a dishonest approach to analyzing events in Israel. If you're analyzing events in Israel with a double standard, so then you're just simply being hate-filled and anti-Semitic. Now, number 12, not all criticism of Israel is false, but not all criticism of Israel is true either. Okay, now you can criticize, when we were talking about before about treating Israel with a double standard as being anti-Semitic, and talking about how Zionism, being anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic, that doesn't mean that you can't criticize Israel. Right? Criticizing Israel is not absolutely anti-Semitic or slanderous. There are legitimate reasons to criticize Israel. Most of the Zionist world today would criticize Israel on some policy that they disagree with. The Knesset is full of speeches criticizing Israel. But many of the most frequent criticism of Israel, that they're apartheid, that they're oppressive, that they're hosting an occupation. So all of these are made by Israel's enemies and are not reflective of true Israeli policy. They're not sources of legitimate debate to say that Israel's an apartheid country. That's not true. To say that Israel's oppressive towards Palestinians, that's not true. So these are not true criticisms. There are many criticisms of Israel that are true. Okay, you can list them. We'll be here till tomorrow if we start listing them. But that's an important point to recognize. Okay, let's go on number 13. Israeli politicians and leaders aren't all angels, but they're not all devils as well. Okay, Israel's critics love characterizing Israeli elected leaders as evil people who deserve to be arrested and jailed for crimes. Israeli politicians are like all other politicians. Unfortunately, our politicians are not better than anybody else's. They're not the world's best actors, but they're nowhere near the evil that Israel enemies portray them as to the world. You would think that Israeli politicians, if you read the world's critiques of Israeli politicians, especially ones that are not fair, not the politicians aren't fair, the critiques aren't fair. So if you would read these, you would think that the Israeli politicians are carrying out the most nefarious and evil activities that the world has ever seen, and we know that that's not true. So that is right. So that's and again, we're just like all other politicians. Okay, where politicians are sometimes very good people, and a lot of times they are bad people. Okay, Israelis are not responsible for Palestinian mistakes and miscalculations. Okay, now there are great inequalities between Israelis and Palestinians here in Israel. That's a fact. Okay, anybody that tells you otherwise and tells you that you're wrong, that Israelis and Palestinians are treated exactly the same, that's ridiculous. Okay, they are not. But just because there's something that people are treated unequally doesn't mean that there's an injustice being perpetrated. Okay, the inequality. Listen to that point. I want to make it again because so many times we point out an inequality and assume that means that something bad is happening. No, sometimes inequalities are just the way the world is. Now, inequalities between Israelis and Palestinians are not unjust inequalities that are Israel's obligations to correct. Just because Israel is the one that's putting these inequalities into effect doesn't mean that it's Israel's responsibility to correct them. Israel has a right to create inequalities. But why? Because most of the inequalities that you find are caused by Palestinians' poor personal and political choices, including the choice for terrorism, okay, including their political choices, including rejecting peace deals and their intransigence in the face of Israel's offers. Israel makes peace offers all the time, or at least they used to until they realized that it was absolutely pointless. And Palestinians never came back with their own plans. They would just say no and keep saying no, and then they would choose terrorism and violence. So Israelis aren't responsible for Palestinian mistakes and their miscalculations. Israel doesn't then have to go ahead and try to do better than the Palestinians are doing for themselves. Okay, that is point number 14. Let's go on to number 15. Jews treat Palestinians well. Now, if you're a Palestinian apologist and you're watching this and you hear me say that Jews treat Palestinians well, you'll probably think I'm crazy. And you'll say, what are you talking about? Palestinians have a horrible life. Well, that's not true. The narrative of Israeli oppression is nothing but a fable. When the layers of lies are peeled away, even a cursory survey of Palestinian Arab life under Israeli rule reveals a life with human rights. Yes, Palestinians have all human rights. Nobody can list for me a human right that Palestinians are denied here in Israel. Okay, you can't list that. People make up rights. They say the right to travel freely. Well, that's not a right listed by the United Nations. People can't just travel freely. The nations have borders, as does Israel. Okay, so the Palestinians have opportunity and they're treated fairly. Claims of a life of hardship are contradicted by the plethora of Arab-owned late-model luxury cars that you see, mansions spread out throughout Judea and Samaria, what the world calls the West Bank. it's for people that live here, it's ludicrous when you hear these accusations because we see how Palestinians live. Jobs in Israel, joint industrial zones are available to Arabs, and the healthcare and education available to Palestinian Arabs is among the highest rated in the Middle East. Palestinians in Syria are jealous of Palestinians that are quote unquote oppressed by Israelis. Okay. Number 16, it's only under Israeli rule that religious sites are open to all world religions. Okay? When the land of Israel was under the rule of Christian crusaders, Muslims, Ottomans, the British, and the Jordanians, the religious sites were closed to one or two of the world's religions, usually to us, usually to the Jews. It was only in 1948 and then again in 1967 when all religious sites in Israel came under Israeli rule that all people and religions were given the freedom to visit all religious sites in Israel. Okay, it's an incredibly important point to recognize that for 19 years Jews couldn't go to the Western Wall. Okay, that's when Jordan ruled over Jerusalem, they would not allow Jews to go to the Western Wall. And today, right, anybody can pray wherever they want as long as the host religion feels that it's okay. Let's go on here. Okay, so number 17, the U.S.-Israel relationship is a partnership. Okay, now the United States provides Israel with more than $4 billion a year in military aid. That is a fact. Okay, it's designated. There's a memorandum of understanding that guarantees $3.8 billion, but it usually goes higher. There's usually a supplementary research and development bill that provides Israel with a couple hundred extra $1 million. It gets up there. Okay, so now. Many people misunderstand this aid as charity that America gives its needy ally Israel, right? We're like a schnorr, we have our hands out begging for money. Okay, so but that's the farthest thing from the truth, right? That American military aid to Israel isn't charity; it's an investment in the partnership that provides America with the highest intelligence, highest research, and technology available. Israel is constantly improving American weaponry and sending those improvements to America. Our last point, our 18th point here, is that while many consider Israeli rule of the West Bank illegal, America and Israel do not. The international community, we see it time and time again in repeated United Nations resolutions, considers Israel's rule of Judea and Samaria, where I'm sitting right now, the region of the world that the world calls the West Bank, to be inconsistent with international law. Israel and the United States do not agree with that assessment. Their point, as former American Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said, is the establishment of Israeli civilian settlements in the West Bank is not per se inconsistent with international law. So when people tell you, no, everybody agrees that Israeli rule of the West Bank is illegal, it's an occupation, understand that that's not true. The United States, including its lawyers, not just talking about politicians, all agree that Israeli rule of the West Bank is not illegal, okay, and we can tell the rest of the world that they're wrong. Okay, those are our 18 points. I'm glad that you joined, whether you're watching this live or you're going to be watching it later on YouTube or on Facebook or on Instagram. Okay, have a very, very good